It all started with one decision that wiped out an entire kingdom in just 2 days. In July of 1187, the most powerful Christian army in the Holy Land walked away from a safe position, marched straight into a trap, and ended up surrounded in suffocating heat, no water, no hope, no way out. When the fighting was over, thousands of men were dead or captured. The legendary True Cross had been lost, and the road to Jerusalem was wide open. It was a defeat so complete it would change the course of the Crusades forever. To understand how it happened, you have to go back a few years. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was anything but a united force. The Crusaders still held key cities across the Holy Land, but internal feuds were tearing the kingdom apart from the inside. Rival lords fought over power, alliances were constantly breaking down, and many leaders trusted each other even less than they trusted their enemies. Then, in August of 1186, King Baldwin V died. He was 9 years old. The succession crisis that followed put Guy of Lusignan on the throne, a king that a large part of the nobility never fully accepted or trusted. And while the Christians were busy fighting among themselves, a man on the other side of the border was quietly building something much bigger. His name was Saladin, and he had a plan the Crusaders never saw coming. Over years of military campaigns and political maneuvering, Saladin had consolidated power over Egypt, Damascus, Aleppo, and much of the Middle East. More importantly, he had managed to unite a large part of the Muslim world under the banner of jihad against the Crusader states. While the Christians remained divided, Saladin was building a stronger, more disciplined empire by the day. He understood that pushing the Crusaders out of the Holy Land would take more than force, it would take patience and strategy. Tensions exploded when Raynald of Chatillon, one of the most aggressive Crusader lords, attacked a Muslim caravan during an existing truce between the two sides. For Saladin, that was unforgivable. The Sultan swore he would kill Raynald with his own hands. From that point on, a major war was inevitable. By 1187, Saladin had begun assembling the largest army he had ever commanded. Thousands of knights, archers, and soldiers rallied to his cause, forming a force that vastly outnumbered the Crusaders. Saladin knew that defeating the Christians would require pulling them away from their defensive strongholds, so instead of attacking the Crusaders directly, he laid a trap. He chose to besiege the city of Tiberias, near the Sea of Galilee. The choice was deliberate. Eshiva, the wife of Raymond of Tripoli, was inside the city, defending it with limited resources. Saladin calculated that the attack would create political pressure on the Crusader leadership and force a bad decision. The Crusaders were camped at La Saphorie, an extremely strong position. They had plenty of water, solid defensive ground, and everything they needed to hold out. Raymond of Tripoli argued they should stay put. Tiberias could be reclaimed later, he said. The priority was not throwing away their strategic advantage. Other leaders agreed, but not everyone was on board. Gerard of Riedfort, the master of the Templars, insisted that staying put was a sign of weakness, a disgrace to Christian knighthood. The argument stretched deep into the night, with both sides going back and forth and neither willing to back down. On the night of July 2nd, King Guy of Lusignan made his call. Against the advice of his most experienced commanders, he ordered the entire army to march to the relief of Tiberias. It was exactly what Saladin had been waiting for. The Crusaders left behind the safety of La Saphorie and set out under brutal heat, moving along a dry, dusty road that cut across hills with no shade and no shelter. On all sides, thousands of Muslim horsemen watched their every move. The trouble started almost immediately. Saladin's mounted archers harassed the Crusader columns relentlessly. They weren't looking for a decisive battle, not yet. Their job was to grind the army down, slow it up, and create chaos. Every mile covered made the situation worse. The heat kept climbing, the dust from the march made it hard to breathe, and above all else, the water was running out. When it became clear the army couldn't reach Tiberias before nightfall, the Crusader leadership decided to change course and head for the springs at Hattin. But Saladin had already seen that coming. His forces moved fast and cut off the route. Suddenly, the Crusaders found themselves cut off from water at the exact moment they needed it most. With no other option, they made camp on a dry plateau near the twin peaks, known as the Horns of Hattin. Through the night, the situation turned desperate. The men were suffering from intense thirst. The horses were weakening and becoming unresponsive. Meanwhile, Saladin's soldiers kept up the psychological pressure. Drums echoed through the darkness. Prayers and chants filled the air. At some point, the Muslim forces set fire to the dry brush surrounding the camp. The smoke and the heat made conditions even more unbearable for men who were already at their limit. Almost nobody got any rest. When the sun came up on July 4th, the Christian army was already running on empty. But they still had to fight. Smoke from the fires cut down visibility across the field. Arrows from thousands of archers rained down on the Crusader formations without letting up. The men tried to push toward water and found walls of enemy fighters everywhere they turned. Every charge cost more energy from soldiers who were already on the verge of breaking down. Raymond of Tripoli led a desperate attempt to punch through the encirclement. After brutal fighting, he managed to break out with part of his men, but most of the army was still trapped. The infantry began to fall apart. Soldiers abandoned their formations and scrambled for shelter in the nearby hills. Others simply collapsed where they stood, too exhausted to keep going. Thirst had become just as deadly as any enemy sword. Even surrounded and running on fumes, the Crusader knights launched charge after charge against Saladin's lines. At several points, they actually pushed the Muslim forces back. But every advance burned through what little was left in the tank. Saladin's men would fall back, regroup, and come right back. Slowly, the ring closed tighter. At the center of the battlefield stood King Guy of Lusignan, surrounded by the toughest survivors of the Crusader army. They fought to the absolute limit, protecting both the royal tent and the most sacred relic in the kingdom, the true cross. But no amount of courage or faith could make up for the lack of water, rest, and organization. One by one, the Crusader positions began to collapse. When the king's tent fell, the battle was over. Hundreds of knights surrendered. Thousands of soldiers were captured or killed. The true cross fell into Saladin's hands. The army that had defended the Crusader states for decades had been effectively wiped out in a single afternoon. Few military defeats in all of medieval history were so total and so fast. After the battle, Guy of Lusignan and many of the nobles were brought before Saladin. Raynald of Chatillon, the man who had broken the truce years earlier, was among the prisoners. The Sultan had not forgotten his promise. Raynald was executed on the spot. Other nobles were spared and held for ransom, but hundreds of captured Templars and Hospitallers were put to death by Saladin's order. The fallout was immediate. With no army left to defend the kingdom, cities and fortresses started falling one after another. Acre, Jaffa, Sidon, Beirut, and dozens of other Crusader positions were taken in the months that followed. Only the city of Tyre held on, kept alive by fleets sailing in from the Mediterranean, making it the last Christian foothold in the region. Finally, in October of 1187, Jerusalem itself surrendered. The city the Crusaders had seized nearly 90 years earlier was back under Muslim control. The Battle of Hattin wasn't just a military victory. It was the result of careful planning, patience, and a deep understanding of the terrain. Saladin had already won before the main fighting even started. He chose where to fight, when to fight, and what conditions his enemies would be forced to fight under. By turning thirst into a weapon and the landscape into an ally, he destroyed the main Crusader army in the region and permanently changed the course of history. It was a masterclass in using your enemy's weaknesses against them. But the story wasn't over. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves across Europe. Kings, lords, and knights received the news in disbelief. A massive new expedition was put together in response. Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa himself set out on campaign, though he would never make it to the Holy Land. Legendary names like Richard the Lionheart were about to enter the stage. The Holy Land was on the verge of a whole new chapter of the Crusades. And it all started in that scorching summer of 1187, when thousands of men marched into a trap they would never escape. Thanks for watching.